I'm sure that over the last year or so, you've probably heard this sound on social media somewhere.
Take off the foo-foo, take off the cloud chase, take off the Wi-Fi.
A mashup of Kendrick Lamar's N95 and Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place. With Radiohead being my favourite band in the world and Kendrick Lamar being my favourite rapper in the world, I was loving the cross-pollination of fans, especially younger ones. Radiohead fans hearing To Pimp a Butterfly for the first time, and Kendrick fans being introduced to In Rainbows. On the surface of it, their sounds couldn't be more different, existing in entirely different genres from different sides of the Atlantic. But what I believe connects these two, and why they both are a couple of my favourite artists ever, is the attention to detail, experimentation, and evolution they share in all aspects of their art. Kendrick, at the start of his career, may as well be a completely different artist to who he is today, and that goes for Radiohead too. As two of the most acclaimed artists of their respective generations, there is of course a large sample size of people who love both of these artists and their music. But if you take a couple of steps back and look at the bigger picture, and you're a bit of an obsessive fan like I am, some parallels between the two become particularly noticeable. The following theory is one that has been kind of floating around various forums for a number of years, but as a stan of both artists, I thought I'd put my own spin and perspective on how these parallels line up and what it says about both artists. And of course, it's just a bit of fun too. In very simple terms, the theory is as follows. Kendrick and Radiohead's discographies seem to line up perfectly with each other as they release more material, in terms of themes, scope, and artistic direction. I'm going to track these parallels right from their supposed beginnings and see just how well this strange niche fan theory holds up.
You boo-boo, you tea, you turn down, you thirsty.
Now yes, Overly Dedicated isn't Kendrick Lamar's first project. He'd been dropping mixtapes and projects for years prior, but this is where we must start for this theory to make any sense. Pablo Honey is the kind of weird stepchild of Radiohead's catalogue. A lot of people don't even really count it because of the immense step up in quality with later releases. Overly Dedicated isn't even an album, so it doesn't have that same reputation, but both projects to varying degrees can be said to contain music that put both artists on the map. Pablo Honey's tracklist contains Creep, which is to this day still probably Radiohead's most widely known song. I would argue that if you asked most people to name another song off of Pablo Honey, they would most likely struggle. Which is a shame because I think there are a few interesting and really underrated songs like Blowout and Anyone Can Play the Guitar. Overly Dedicated doesn't have a certified worldwide hit single like Creep is, however it does include Ignorance is Bliss. This is the song that gained the attention of Dr. Dre, who would eventually sign Kendrick Lamar to his Aftermath label. Nobody's favourite Radiohead album is Pablo Honey, and nobody's favourite Kendrick Lamar project is Overly Dedicated. And that's not to discredit them because both have some really standout songs, but both projects serve as platforms for both artists to find their feet. Neither are representative of their sounds in retrospect, and like any artist finding their voice, they wear their influences fully on their sleeves. Pablo Honey was released in the early 90s, and the Nirvana influence is extremely heavy. The same goes for Overly Dedicated and its clear Lil Wayne influences. But the potential was there. Little flashes of what would eventually define their careers were starting to come through, and that would continue with their next releases.
Fuck that. 8 doobies to the face. Fuck that.
The one before the big one, in my eyes. Both artists now had some recognition, but hadn't fully made it, so to speak. The Bends and Section 80 are both bridges between the past and the future. Radiohead was starting to pull away from the Britpop and grunge sounds and explore some more alternative sounds with darker songwriting. Section 80 had Kendrick first properly foray into concept album territory and was beginning to shake off the overt sounds of his influences in favour of something more original and expressive. For me as well, both albums seemed to kick off both Kendrick and Radiohead's particular fascination with mortality that would continue throughout the rest of their careers. Radiohead did this through the lens of existentialism, particularly on the final song Street Spirit, whereas Kendrick's view was rooted in his religious foundation on songs like Kush and Corinthians. Tom York singing I Can Feel Death, Can See Its Beady Eyes, and Kendrick rapping I'm right on the edge of Everest and I might jump tonight, fundamentally communicates the same thing, staring mortality directly in the face. The framing devices may differ, but underneath that they're expressing very similar emotions and states of mind. While sonically different, we also see the start of what would eventually blossom into full experimentation later down the line. Kendrick was incorporating free jazz and spoken word elements already on songs like Absol's Outro and Rigor Mortis, with those influences becoming key foundations for To Pimp a Butterfly. Radiohead had started to put out a drearier and less aggressive sound. Street Spirit, as previously mentioned, as well as songs like Fake Plastic Trees, speaks to this. Kendrick and Radiohead were heading towards a sound that was introspective, experimental, and original. The bends in Section 80 represented unlimited potential for both artists, and somehow both would blow these expectations out of the water by releasing undisputed classics regardless of genre.
Martin had a dream. Martin had a dream.
The popular one, the one that everyone loves, OK Computer and Good Kid, Mad City are widely regarded as two of the best albums ever made. Both serve as the payoff to a few years of evolution and potential. These albums both also function as projects that have massive commercial appeal whilst remaining forward-thinking. In the respective quote-unquote genres of rock and hip-hop, they tick every box that makes it a classic within the genre. At the same time, they somehow find the scope and space to be experimental and different and forward-thinking. For Kendrick, it was effectively writing an entire album about a single day in 2004 and how the minutiae of day-to-day life can have massive repercussions. For Radiohead, it was the almost prophetic peek through to the window of the 21st century with a strong focus on isolation, disillusionment, and paranoia. These are the accessible masterpieces that separated both artists from their peers. Also, as you would imagine, the themes of mortality and death continue to permeate both albums. No Surprises and Sing About Me are superficially very different songs. No Surprises is a song about blissful ignorance, accepting a life of mundanity without joy or spark. Sing About Me is a triptych tale of people in Compton dealing with abuse, violence, and revenge. However, fundamentally, they share a core, a paranoia about death, and a fear of being trapped into a life you didn't choose. Massive hits like Karma Police and Swimming Pools, lining up side by side with sprawling songs with multiple sections like Paranoid Android and Mad City, are what defined both albums. As you would imagine, both artists were catapulted into a whole new level of fame, and with that came more expectation. Both embarked on extensive tours in the aftermath. Radiohead played over 100 shows in the coming year, including a Glastonbury headline. Kendrick embarked on the Good Kid, Mad City tour, on top of opening for both Kanye West and Eminem. Radiohead and Kendrick would both wait 3 years before their next full-length release after this whirlwind period, and both would take some of the sharpest left turns in popular music history. The albums, the masterpieces that changed their careers forever, and somehow exceeded expectations of the preceding albums. We'd had a glimpse of Kendrick and Radiohead experimenting with their sound, but still firmly being rooted in traditionally accessible and of-its-time palettes. Kid A and To Pimp a Butterfly sound nothing like what was popping off at the time of their releases. If you looked at the #1 albums in the US before and after Kid A dropped, it stands out as a ridiculous anomaly. Limp Bizkit, Ja Rule, and Madonna are just some of the names that come up, and Kid A just there in the middle is hilarious. The idea that across America people were playing Idiotech just a couple of weeks removed from Limp Bizkit is insane. To Pimp a Butterfly is also a hip-hop anomaly, but not because it isn't quote-unquote hip-hop, quite the opposite in fact, but rather because what was about to pop off at the time. 2015 was when the new wave of trap music in the States was really taking off. Young Thug, Future, Migos, Metro Boomin, 21 Savage, and more were, all around this time, starting to reach the heights of their fame. And this point isn't to slight their music, because I love these artists, but it's just to illustrate just how off the beaten track Kendrick was going. Kid A challenged its audience to a point where they were considering what even is a rock band. Half the songs had electronically programmed drums, no guitars, and almost indiscernible lyrics. Yesterday I woke up sucking on a lemon. Ice Age coming sounded like incoherent nonsense upon first listen. It was the beginning of the abstraction of Radiohead. Kendrick's lyrics, meanwhile, weren't as abstract. In fact, they were meticulously written and timely, with every song eventually being thematically linked to the closing poem recited on Mortal Man. Sonically, he was also pulling from funk and jazz and neo-soul. Both albums have some of Kendrick and Radiohead's wildest ever songs. For Free Interlude and the national anthem come to mind. Like previously mentioned, Kendrick had dipped his toes into free jazz and spoken word elements on Section 80, and this was the culmination of that. Both albums also contain some of the saddest songs in their respective discographies. How to Disappear Completely is one of the most haunting, beautiful things ever made. You has Kendrick fighting suicidal ideation as he blames himself for a number of shortcomings. Again, both songs are incredibly different, but the one thing continuing to link them is that focus on mortality and, naturally, depression. Of course, Kid A opens with Everything in Its Right Place, that served as the song for the remix mentioned at the start of this video. When To Pimp a Butterfly first came out, a number of people, including myself, theorized that How Much a Dollar Cost had sampled Pyramid Song from Radiohead's Amnesiac. Whilst the keys do sound incredibly similar, there is no confirmation that this is a direct sample, but might be some sort of inspiration at least. Kid A was definitely more divisive than To Pimp a Butterfly on first release, but it still did have its own set of detractors. Years down the line, however, both albums are considered among the greatest in musical history and had people questioning once again what is next.
Love won't get you out of this. Drugs won't get you out of this. Pain won't get you out of this.
Clearly, the Kid A and To Pimp a Butterfly recording sessions were so incredibly productive that Kendrick and Radiohead were able to put out even more material in the following year. Expanding on the sounds of the previous albums, both projects are arguably even gloomier and experimental than Kid A and To Pimp a Butterfly. It's important to note that Radiohead do not see Amnesiac as a B-side or Leftovers album, but its own thing entirely. And whilst it does share the experimental, confounding essence of Kid A, it is very different. Untitled Unmastered, however, is explicitly a collection of leftovers from the To Pimp a Butterfly sessions, with the title and unnamed tracks pointing to this. Regardless, it is super interesting to see just how much material these two artists were able to cook up in this period, so much so that it warranted two separate albums. To me, both albums feel apocalyptic and dystopian, Untitled Unmastered for its lyrics and Amnesiac for its soundscape. Kendrick literally describes the apocalypse on the opening Untitled track, something he has done on several occasions, and nobody can tell me that songs like Polk Pull Revolving Doors don't just flat out sound like the end of the world. A fun thing for me that I noticed is Kendrick raps,
Public bathroom, college classrooms been deserted. Another trumpet that sounded off and everyone heard it.
It's happening.
and Amnesiac ends with Life in a Glass House, which is driven by these off-kilter trumpets. Amnesiac and Untitled Unmastered represent a particularly creative period for both artists, but unknown to both, they would come out just before some of the biggest political upheavals in the 21st century.
So I was taking a walk the other day, and I seen a woman.
Hail to the Thief came out in June 2003. In the period between Amnesiac and this album, the world had experienced the 9/11 terror attacks, the subsequent war on terror, the first term of the Bush administration, and a second landslide election victory for Labour here in the UK. Damn released in April of 2017 in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election, a slew of police shootings including Philando Castle and Alton Sterling, and Russia's supposed influence of the 2016 election. Both albums are inherently tied to the political climate at the time, with some of the lyrics and artwork for Hail to the Thief coming directly from war on terror headlines and discourse. Kendrick and Radiohead attempt to tackle current affairs through their own personal lens, with the musical backdrop being somewhat more of a return to a traditional sound of their respective genres. Guitars, bass, and familiar strong structures were back on Hail to the Thief, and there were catchy hooks and trap instrumentals on Damn. Perhaps to make the weight of what they were talking about more digestible, because subject matter wise, you can make the argument that these are much darker albums than the preceding ones. Damn is a conflicted, violent, existential tale, whilst Hail to the Thief is a worried, angry, bleak look at the world. XXX and A Wolf at the Door are, to me, explicitly both critiques of capitalism and the systems that facilitate it. Brutal but realist descriptions of machine-like institutions that allow inequality, apathy, and violence to flourish. Die-hard fans would rarely claim that either of these albums are their best work. For Kendrick, that debate continues to usually be between Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly, and with Radiohead that debate is usually between Kid A and OK Computer. But Damn and Hail to the Thief are both incredibly important albums, the most overtly politically charged in either artist's career. They still contain amazing standout songs with wide scopes in concepts. But what it allowed them to do was, after this, take some extra time and return years down the line with their most personal, reflective, and therapeutic works to date.
You broke the generational curse. Say thank you, Dad.
Thank you, Daddy.
At this point in their respective careers, they are well established and respected as some of the most impactful artists of their generations. They're both at a crossroads with new label situations on the horizon for both, and they take a number of years to return with a new album. Radiohead had finished their record deal with EMI, whilst Kendrick was about to finish his almost 20-year association with TDE. Whilst Damn and Hail to the Thief were conflicted albums wrestling with the outside world and its effect on personal relationships, In Rainbows and Mr. Morale serve as the least politically charged and most intimate albums of both of their careers. In Rainbows is my favourite Radiohead album and might be my favourite album ever. It feels like an exploration of the sensuality and intimacy of death. It's the most optimistic album about death I think you'll ever hear. In true Radiohead fashion, there is anxiety, numbness, and depression sprinkled throughout for good measure. Mr. Morale, however, is a full-on therapy session allowing Kendrick to strip himself of the so-called savior complex he had and deliver harsh truths about himself before growing. The facade has been shed for both artists, and we get to see the most personal and vulnerable versions of them that we've ever seen. Musically as well, there are moments on Mr. Morale that 100% remind me of Radiohead. Don't tell me that United in Grief doesn't sound like something Johnny Greenwood could have cooked up in a basement somewhere.
I grieve different.
The jazzy pianos and tight drum work sound like Amnesiac-era Radiohead. But more importantly, both projects serve to shift the perspective and kind of demystify some aspects of their character. Kendrick raps about his failings as a partner, his insecurities as a father, and how he struggled to break cycles of trauma. Tom York more abstractly worries about unfulfilled promise, touches on themes of desperation, and ultimately accepts death. It's pretty fun shit, isn't it? But they are both the kind of albums that are impossible to make any earlier in their careers. The intimacy of In Rainbows is elevated by the lore of Radiohead's experimental, otherworldly, abstract, socially charged lyrics. Kendrick's admissions and therapy sessions only resonate when you have the context of albums like Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly. Sorry I Didn't Save the World Again on the final song means a whole lot more after you've heard To Pimp a Butterfly. Of course, this is where the journey so far ends for Kendrick in terms of album releases. In the 17 years since In Rainbows, we've only had 2 more albums from Radiohead in the shape of King of Limbs and A Moon-Shaped Pool. Does this mean that the next Kendrick album will be his King of Limbs? If we are to continue this theory, then it has to be, but I sincerely hope not. Regardless, these parallels, I believe, speak to something fundamental about both artists. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. Different genres, different nationalities, different ethnicities, different approaches to songwriting. But the core essences are the same. The forward-thinkingness, the growth, and challenging their audience. And to me, that means so much more than judging how different or similar artists are on pure aesthetic or sound.